We lived in the city for 18 years before we moved up here to the country. And we bought this property that was, it's about 9.5 acres. It was an old perennial nursery before we bought it. And so there's all these hoop houses everywhere. And we had these grand plans of being a market vegetable garden and growing flowers and herbs and for things for teas and tinctures, and then doing wine and cider and spirits on top of that. And after
the first summer,
after one summer, we kind of found out that it was a little too much work to take on all that at once. And the wine thing that we started as just a small part of that took off very quickly and proved to be the most and I guess cost-effective use of our time. And so I was more than happy to make more wine and keep making wine. And so we decided to roll with it. And we've been growing pretty steadily ever since. After that first year, we also had our daughter. And so that also kind of took half of our work hours out of commission, because we've been caring for her since then, which is amazing. But yeah, we've been focused primarily on the orchard and vineyard, and doing more of the kind of permaculture establishment and vineyard establishment here, while we're also buying in fruit from all over the state to make our wines and ciders.
Yeah, and I'll just add that neither of us had a background in agriculture. So when we found out we were buying this house and moving, it was kind of a crash course, and we just read a lot of books, and we felt like we could do anything. So we were going to have, obviously, you know, the fruit and vegetable market. And then we were like, and wine will do in the winter. And, you know, we kind of had it split like seasonally, that we could do all these things. I was reading about goats, and we were going to have a herd of goats right away. And then it being just the two of us, we realized that and everybody was saying it was too much, but we were like, no, we can do it all. And so after that first summer, it kind of just shrunk down to wine, and then our personal vegetable garden.
Coalesced, I would say, rather than shrunk down.
Right.
It's still a lot of work.
Yeah.
And so how do you guys between yourselves split up the work with Wild Ark Farm? Or do you do everything together, or do you each have realms of authority?
I do a lot of the grunt work, and Crystal is the brains.
Oh, really? I was going to say, so Todd is the winemaker. And I've started taking on the vineyard management. And then we do a lot of the stuff together, which would be me cleaning up after all of Todd's messes.
Yeah, we pretty much are split. And yeah, Crystal's better at keeping things alive than I am. So after our major replant of the vineyard this year, she really started spending a lot more time in the vineyard and in the fields doing, you know, hand pruning work. And I'm in the winery, but I'm the winemaker, and then I do all the moving stuff around and logistics and how do we get this stuff from this tank to that tank. And she's still a far better taster than I am. So every time I'm done out there, I bring in a few samples for her. I'm like, is this good yet? No, not yet. All right, let's keep working. But yeah, beyond that, it's pretty much split evenly. And when we're bottling, especially this year when we weren't able to bring as many volunteers up to help us with bottling and labeling, we'd be out there for 8 hours, bottling 100 cases, labeling it as we go. Sadly, having to sit our daughter in front of an iPad for most of that time to keep her company. But yeah, we're split pretty evenly across the board.
So one thing that I know we have such little time, and we have a million things we want to ask you. So I think one thing that is that would be helpful to have you kind of frame for us might be, you know, your philosophy towards farming and like what you have planted, and kind of, I know you've had some challenges, especially this year. So maybe if you could give us an update on where you are with your planted vineyards and your own farming, and then maybe take us through and explain that relationship with your decision to also buy fruit and your relationship with growers. You know, kind of take us through both of these different things that are happening at the same time.
Sure. All right. All right. We have an acre planted here, but we planted most of it in 2018, the spring of 2018. I think we'd put in 1,200 vines that season of all vinifera. So it was Pinot, Chardonnay, and Cab Franc. And that just so happened to be the worst year in like 100 years for overwintering plants in the Northeast. There was an early frost in December that killed a lot of the vines that hadn't hardened off yet. There was a polar vortex in January, so 3 days of like sub-zero Celsius temperatures. And then there was a late frost in May, so right after the buds had started pushing. And so all of that just basically conspired to kill off about 70% of our new planting. So that was like all the work we had done that year. And then for that whole summer of 2019, I was out there still trying to take care of all the plants that were still there, which still meant doing passes to hill up and dehill, still spraying our organic sprays. And so when we finally replanted half of that vineyard this year, we ended up planting Itasca, which is a white cold hardy hybrid in place of the Chardonnay that was there before. And we're still up in the air, but we might plant some more Pinot because that did the best of what did survive back there. But we're kind of splitting the difference now between hybrids and vinifera on the home farm here. But we are still growing fully biodynamically and organically here. And then the lessons that we're learning there, we're able to kind of share with the grower partners that we have across the state.
Well, one thing I just want to say or add that for us that year, we didn't realize everything was dead and gone. We just kept waiting for it to come back. And then for everybody else, hybrids and vinifera, both local vineyards, they lost their canes. And so they had no fruit for the whole season.
Or for 2 seasons, yeah.
So, I mean, it wasn't really necessarily like hybrids would have saved us because they were just babies 1 year. They didn't have enough time to establish and we lost them. And then it was too late in the season once we realized how much died to reorder any plants. And so we went a whole nother season before we planted again.
Yeah, so we're like 4 or 5 years behind our target production goal for on-farm fruit. But all of that kind of in the process has led us to our new philosophy, which is, we kind of feel like it's a better thing, more of a net positive for us to find growers in New York who are growing more conventionally and move them towards organic practices than it is to then, take out more of our native grasslands here and replant them with monocrop vineyards. So that's kind of allowed us to rethink our philosophy for sourcing and what we're trying to do for New York State, which is like to move the needle a little bit to show people that you can grow this way. So we're treating our vineyard here now, which will eventually be in production, as more of an experimental vineyard where we're learning and experimenting with the new bio-antifungals that come out every season and different spray cycles to figure out what works best so we can share that knowledge with the growers that we work with, which are like the Amarici vineyard, which is our perfect example. We found someone who was 80% of the way towards organic, but had just been spraying synthetic fungicides for 20 years. And we said, listen, we're using these bio-antifungals, these Bacillus subtilis strains that are working great. Try swapping this in for your mancozeb or whatever you're spraying for powdery and downy mildew for a season, and we'll buy all your fruit. Let's see how it works. And that vineyard's been fully organic since 2017 now. And so we buy all the fruit from there. A new family bought the farm and they're not winemakers. So we're working with them on the spray program. We give them the full schedule. We keep an eye on the weather up there because it's about 2 hours north of us, and they do all the spraying for us. And then we go up with our team in the fall to harvest everything. But some of the other growers, especially in the Finger Lakes where it's a more established business and kind of growing culture, it's harder to train people away from things that their family may have been doing for 40 or 50 or 60 years. But we have had pretty good luck, at least with, for us, what the first step is, hey, would you please consider not spraying herbicide? And we'll buy some fruit from you if you do that for a season. And we had the good fortune of having one other buyer ask one of our growers that last year. And so between the two of us, we were able to buy their entire vinifera crop from a new vineyard that they'd taken on, and they agreed to not spray any herbicide at all for the whole season. And, we paid him a 15% premium for that, which you have to do. We've got to make it economically viable for both of us because they're doing a lot more handwork when they're not able to strip spray. And so now this year, the question is, okay, can we talk to the other grower and work on getting you on a more organic spray cycle for downy and powdery mildew? And we'll pay you another 15, 20% premium for that. So, we aren't always working with organic fruit, but we're being as transparent as we can. The back labels of all of our wines have a little code on the bottom right that says whether the farming is practicing organic, sustainable, conventional, and then it also has our sulfur additions, because about half our wines are 0 sulfur and some have 20 parts per million added at some point in the process. So we're just trying to be transparent about all of our sourcing and all of our winemaking practices, and then people can make the choice. If they're super sulfur sensitive and they don't want our sulfured wines, they could buy the 0.0 wines. If they don't want to support conventional agriculture in any way, they don't have to buy the few of our wines that we're buying from conventional growers in the hopes of moving them towards organic practices. But yeah, I think for us, the end goal is to kind of change the conversation in New York State and show people that it is financially viable and better for the end product to move to those growing practices.
Yeah.
Yeah, we noticed that you got the Sawmill Creek fruit, right?
Yeah,
And that's in the Finger Lakes, and they're not at the moment. Are they open to moving towards organic farming?
That's a hard sell, because they're one of those old,
Yeah,
60,
I
70 year
know.
businesses. But they are certified sustainable
Okay.
on most of their home vineyards. And so for us, it's a matter of, we made our first wine from them last year, and we're bringing it to them, and we're also like trying to show it around New York State, and they see the kind of press and coverage that we're getting, and I think they appreciate it. So that's a longer term goal. We're not we have another grower up there, the one who's converting for us, and we're buying a significantly larger amount of fruit from them. But Sawmill Creek, it would be a coup if we could get them to make any shift in their growing practices.
Well, you have to start the battle to win the battle. So
right, yeah.
I think
So
I applaud you. Because I think that maybe to give people some context, and it was something that I only learned when we started our business working with Luke, because he's very familiar with New York growers, that there was, I think, is it Bloomfield? What's the producer in upstate New York that is a biodynamic?
Bloomer Creek.
Bloomer Creek,
Bloomer
yeah,
Creek,
organic,
right? And so
yeah.
right, organic. And so I think that some people, maybe especially coming from the Pacific Northwest, don't understand that there's always been this conventional notion, right, that upstate New York and New York generally has so much issues with fungicide that they could never farm organically, or they always had to use fungicide. So is that really part of the battle you have, is just trying to upturn that conventional wisdom?
Can I say something here?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even before we started, we just started with Cornell Cooperative Extension. And we were doing these meetups with other producers, and we didn't own the property yet. We didn't have any vines of our own planted. And we were telling them how we were going to do this. Oh yeah, we're doing it organically, and we got no support. We couldn't find anybody. We found one producer who said that they had tried for 2 years and it was just a complete failure, impossible. And they switched to conventional, and we wouldn't be able to do it. So without any real farming background, the only way that we have any hope to change anyone's mind is by paying for the losses, right?
Right, sure.
So if we buy the fruit and ask, that these changes be made and pay for the loss, then
yeah, that's one thing that's not really as common out here, or not even common, but unheard of. We were like, well, in California, people do acreage contracts and guarantee a certain, purchase price per acre, regardless of yield. So that way you can control the yield yourself. And then if there are problems with the growing practices, you take on some of that risk. And so that's something we've had to push for here as well. We have to show them, listen, we understand it's a risk. We're going to take shoulder part of that because we're going to pay you, $4,000 per acre, regardless of what your yield is. Yeah, that's been helpful, but yeah, it's an uphill battle. Like Crystal said, people have tried and failed a little bit and had bad luck with it, but there's also a lot of new technology out there. A lot of these new sprays have only come into the market in the last 5 or 10 years. And so, yeah, it's It's a learning experience for sure. And we're learning as we go and hoping to share that knowledge. But I also, like you said, people from the Pacific Northwest or California might not understand the disease pressures here. I was looking at like, oh, annual rainfall. Look, it looks like, Willamette Valley has the same annual rainfall as we do. So they're as wet as we are. The difference is all of their rain comes in late winter, early spring. All of ours comes in summer to fall when it's actually much more detrimental to the crop. So these are lessons that you have to learn kind of the hard way when you've got a severe downy mildew problem in the middle of the season.
Right. And so I guess that really takes us to, the other side of the economics. There's the issue of purchasing fruit in a region where the fruit is historically maybe more expensive because land is more expensive. You have more losses, and so what was that connected with your decision to find ways to produce something in addition to traditional wines?
I think at first our idea was that we would be a little more evenly split between wine and cider because apples are easier to grow here organically and are more plentifully planted. And if you're willing, like we are, to work with culinary fruit and not specifically fruit grown for cider, then you can really get access to some interesting fruit from some interesting places. And then once the idea for piquette kind of came to us, or was brought to us, and we started doing that, we realized, oh, this is how we can stretch our grape budget significantly and help keep our prices down in general. I guess it was more of price management. It was more keeping the wine costs or the wine prices down because we were able to get more per ton of fruit in the end because we're making 50% more wine with the piquette output.
And what's your approach? Like, could you just take us through your general winemaking philosophy? Because I think that, you guys have gotten so much press for your piquette, but to be honest, I've been super blown away by your wines. That Chardonnay, it's like, it was amazing. And
Thank
it just, we were able to keep a couple bottles. And so we got to drink it after like 6 or 9 months in bottle. And it just kept getting more and more beautiful.
Thanks. Yeah, we've been able now to actually hold stuff back longer since we've been producing enough that it makes sense for us on the cash flow side to like keep things in bottle for 6 to 8 months before we release them. But yeah, generally we're pretty classically low intervention. Anything that we hand pick with our crew and can make sure the fruit coming in is really sanitary, we will not add any sulfur at crush or during the fermentation. If we're getting fruit in from another picking crew, we'll kind of make the call at that point whether we want to add 10 or 20 parts or let it go and see if it stays clean. And then we really don't do anything during élevage other than occasionally racking and stirring if we feel like it needs some oxygen. We try to keep everything on the gross lees as long as possible because that's a protective agent for us that helps keep things, as long as the lees are clean and not producing any reductive compounds or off aromas or flavors. Gross lees unstirred at the bottom of a tank or barrel are like our best friend. So we usually just, once something's in a tank, we test it, and if it's good, that's Luca chiming in. And if it's good, we don't touch it. If it needs a little intervention, like I said, stirring, we don't really have temperature control or any like jacketed tanks that we could really use to warm or cool things, but we will move things out into the crush pad in the winter if they need to be cooled down, or put them in a little tent with a space heater if we feel like they need to be warmed up to kickstart the fermentation more. But beyond that, the decisions other than that are, how much skin contact are we using, whether we're doing whole cluster. That was actually a big kind of discussion that we've had with a lot of local growers, because everyone in cooler climates is like, you can't use stems, they're unripe, they'll make your wines bitter. And we have had the opposite experience. We've put in, first of all, we're chewing our stems and seeds at harvest to make sure that there are no super bitter compounds in there. They are tannic, they are astringent, and if you leave something on the skins with a whole cluster maceration with all the stems in there for 5 or 6 weeks, like we often do, it starts to get bitter. But all of those shorter chain bitter tannins will bind up and either settle out or integrate nicely with some time in the barrel. So, the first time it happened, I was scared. I had a wine that I tasted, and in the tank as it was fermenting, it got really bitter. And I said, oh God, press it immediately, get it into barrels, it's ruined. And then after 6 months in barrel, it was beautiful. So stems are a big part of what we do here. And, you know, as a holistic philosophy in a colder climate, I think that managing pH is something that we have to think about, because our grapes are coming in with a must pH of sometimes below 3, but usually around 3 to 3.1. And it's high acid, and we make high acid wines. But if you want to temper that somewhat, the potassium in the stems, with given enough times of contact with the must, will bring that pH up half a point or a point, and help kind of even out the acid. So, you know, leaves and stems, I guess, are our core philosophies for how we work with our fruit here. And that's just, you know, that's started as experimentation and has kind of settled into our core philosophy. It's been, you know, oh, maybe this will work, let's try it. And when it works, and then we do a little more of that next year.
Do you do your own lab work, or do you work with a lab?
We have a little lab here that lets us do pH, TA, and we'll sometimes do YAN, yeast assimilable nitrogen. A lot of white grapes in our climate tend to not have a lot of nitrogen, and you can get stuck ferments or a lot of reductive compounds from those. But for the most part, we just check pH and TA as it comes in, check it again once we barrel it down, and then anything else we'll send up to Cornell. They have an Inofos, so you only have to send a small sample for an IR scan, and it's cheap and fast. So when we need to get a quick check-in on where things are, we'll send up and get those cheap scans done. I'd like to get a more complex lab set up here, but they're prohibitively expensive. We're actually in talks with a company out of Europe that's developing a new handheld scanner, and we might get to use it for free for this next season. We'll see. That would be great.
So Todd, did you have to teach yourself all this chemistry, or did you come in with some knowledge of this?
I took chemistry and organic chemistry in college, so I remember how to titrate at least, and that's a big part of all of the lab work that we do. But yeah, for the most part, it's reading and studying and figuring out. Like, for me, the lab work doesn't so much dictate the winemaking process, because there aren't a lot of interventions that we make. We're not deacidifying or doing anything major, but it does help us get kind of the waypoints along the wine's development that we can actually put to numbers, so that we can see, you know, oh, last year this came in at this pH, this year it came in a little different. What are we going to do about that, or how will that affect the wines? And yeah, it's all mostly either partially remembered or self-taught.
Well, and what about could you talk a little bit about your ciders? Because I feel like, you know, we have ciders here. We as Walden work with Nate Reddy, who does the Floreal ciders, and Dan Rinke, who does art and science. And so I thought it'd be interesting, since we work with them, for you to maybe talk about how you approach making cider, because I feel like they're really different in styles. And I don't know if it's just for the fruit is different, or the approach to the cider making is why we get that difference in the flavors and texture.
I mean, I think New York fruit is certainly different than Pacific Northwestern fruit. I started making cider in essentially the same way that I make white wines, which is macerate for a couple days and then press and then set it and forget it. We do use a little sulfur in some of the fruit that we bring in, and some of it we kind of just let it go. Again, that depends on where it's coming from and how dropped the fruit looks, how much kind of bruising and interesting development there is on the fruit surface. But essentially, it's the same thing. We'll press into old oak barrels, or sometimes chestnut, and we'll let it sit 8 to 10 months on gross lees, no racking, no stirring, nothing, and just let it kind of develop slowly. And we do like that kind of day or two of maceration, because it lets us get a little bit more structure and tannin. But now that we've started working with some more cider fruit, like the Dabonet in the canned cider this year, you get structure from that too. Those apples actually have some tannin and some structure in them. Yeah, but for the most part, it's just we're doing, if not single varietal, at least single orchard ciders. And we're just trying to see what we can, develop as terroir in the cider world. So the Dabonet and the greening came from Ontario orchards this year, a little further upstate north of the Finger Lakes. And then the other stuff was all culinary fruit from a local orchard in High Falls. And that was awesome because it's 80 to 100-year-old trees. You know, they've got extremely deep roots. It had been neglected for years and just starting to be brought back and sprayed only with neem oil for the season. So no synthetics at all, no fungicides, herbicides, anything. And so in that case, I was like, just give me all the fruit and we're going to like see what it does together, you know, see if it can highlight this, this area. And yeah, we get a little bit more, I mean, I hate using the word funky, but we get some more, you know, non-traditional, non-apple-y cider characteristics in most of our ciders. And I think that's from the native ferment and the lack of sulfur, because we're taking fruit that has sometimes dropped and sat for a day before it gets picked up. But that's terroir too, right?
Right, totally. And
fungus
so
on the
are you working primarily with apples, or do you have access to other fruit? I saw photos of quince, you know, that you'd posted a while ago, but I didn't know if you were working with other fruit.
So we had access to some quince for the 2017 vintage and did a cider with quince and golden apples. We haven't worked with quince, but we have some planted. So eventually here we will. And then we have a lot of Callery and Himalayan wild pear trees on our property. So this year we actually macerated a lot of those and put them into our Northern Spy cider as just kind of an additional texture generator. And we're going to see what that does this year. But we also have Perry pears and culinary pears planted in the food forest that we'll hopefully be harvesting eventually. But yeah, I'm you know, we work with whatever we can find. We also have in the food forest a bunch of understory plantings like aronia berry and sea buckthorn that I think we'll start to incorporate in some more experimental drinks down the road. And then we've never released them commercially, but we've also used the local honey that we get here to make honey wines with some, there's Kusa dogwood berry on our property that has these crazy little alien cherry looking fruits that taste like lychee. And then just some other herbal additions. So those are more experimental for us to kind of figure out what we can do with them. But long term, we might do some more mixed fruit fermentations.
And how does it, you know, what's the difference between producing beverages in cans versus bottles? Is there a logistical challenge to one or the other more challenge?
We treat them the same way as well because we can condition in the same way that we bottle condition. So the night before canning, we'll dose and mix the tank with the dosage or the tirage that we use, which is the wildflower honey. And then we'll get it canned and let it carbonate in can. We've come to learn that canning a still product, a flat product, is hard for the machinery at the cannery that we use to put the labels on and to keep things clean. So we might let them inline carbonate it like half a point and then do the rest of it with can conditioning moving forward. That's the only real change that we might make. But then long term, the stuff that we can isn't usually meant for aging. So we don't really consider the oxygen ingress or the, you know, can lining or anything like that. It's just a matter of like, this is more convenient for our consumer. It's more likely to be recycled in the US. And so it's much more lightweight for shipping. So it's for us, it's a good choice for those reasons. And we figure out what to put in cans based on those criteria, which is why we don't really can actual wines, still or sparkling. It's all the lower alcohol, more playful stuff for the most part.
Mm-hmm. And what about design? Do you guys do all your own label designs? Because I think your aesthetics are really interesting as well.
Yeah, we do by default almost.
At this point, it's not default.
Yeah, well, it was at first. We had a friend who was going to help us, and then he got another job and couldn't. So we just had to hustle something together. And then, you know, 5 years later, we're still working with those, you know, same basic concepts and ideas. But yeah, on that front, again, you know, Crystal is the creative director and I'm the pixel pusher. So she says it should look like this. And I'm like, I know Photoshop, I can make that work, or Illustrator, whichever it is. But yeah, we had a nugget of a philosophical idea, and that, you know, we are generally into minimal aesthetics and we wanted it to be minimal but still have a kind of a pastoral feel. So the, hand stamped vibe of the font on top of the black and white kind of minimal look was where we were coming from. And then we've tweaked that a little with the colorful cans, but that's just because those are playful, fun things. We feel like it's a fun way to kind of keep the same aesthetic, but blow it out a little bit.
Well, we have so many people on the call who might have questions. So I'm going to open it up so that we can have other people ask some questions from you. Anyone want to start? Duran, you always have good questions. But I don't want to put you on the spot. Anyone, feel free to jump in.
Mine's not a question. It's just like a statement. I guess I think you guys are great role models for change in organic agriculture, and I think you're doing the right things, are in a good position to promote change. And not a lot of people will want to pay to take the loss from their vineyards, and so I think that's where the disconnect is happening a lot, and why it's taking so long. And obviously, agriculture is like a slow-moving process, but it's faster when there's demand for organic agriculture. I think you guys are, just making the right strides, and I think it's impressive. And a lot of people think that way and want to take that risk. So I think you guys are great role models, and I hope other people will start to catch on and see what you guys are doing. So cool. Kudos for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, we're, like I said, we're trying to share the wealth and the knowledge that we learn with other growers, but we're also, slowly trying to convince other people to make cool and fun wines in New York State, because, that's the other uphill battle. Is New York State is kind of known for the Finger Lakes and Riesling and a little bit of Cab Franc, but I think the hybrids and the other grapes that we can grow here can make great wines as well. I just want more, fun people to come up here and try out what we're doing. So we're having some people make wine in our facility. We have for the past couple of years, just making a barrel or two here or there. I kind of take Pack Small out in California as an example of someone who's just like, come in, make your wine, put it out in the world. If you want to make more, let's make more, and then we'll get you started on your own journey. So that's the other side of that equation, is just kind of offering access to people who want to make a little bit of wine here, so that hopefully they stay in New York and make cool wine here.
Hi, Todd.
Howdy.
How are you? I enjoyed the conference yesterday.
Yeah, that was fun.
It was a long one.
Yeah, we went like 8 hours after they shut off the stream. We kept talking. It was intense.
Well, I thought one of the topics that I found pretty interesting, and I don't know, Trini, this is a technical thing too. I don't know if folks can see.
No, you put the chat question, but I thought we would talk about it now.
Oh yeah. I thought that was fairly interesting, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about, explaining the peewee varieties and where you see the future of those on the vineyard. And I mean, I think you had addressed a bit the hybrid and all that, but just maybe about.
I don't know that any peewees have made their way over to the States yet. I guess California is doing some stuff with the warm climate fixed peewees, the things that are working better where things are getting too warm. Essentially, from my understanding, peewees are vinifera only blends, so they're not really traditional hybrids because it's all vinifera, whereas you've got Labrusca and Riparia and some of the Asian varieties in the hybrids that we're doing here in the US. But essentially what we talked about in that talk, and which was the most interesting thing to me, is that hybrid development in the US used to be, in the Northeast anyway, what works in cold climates, what will stay alive and make decent wine. And now in the last 10 to 15 years, it's shifted to what does well in our climate, but what also requires less input, requires less spray, is less susceptible to mildew and rot. And that's where the crossover with the peewee development is, because they're looking for things that don't have susceptibility to the problems that are plaguing wetter regions around the world. So yeah, I think that if in this kind of shift in consumer perception of the non-well-known varieties keeps moving in the right direction and people are open to things that they haven't heard of, then I think that the peewees and the hybrids will definitely be making inroads and be planted more. I mean, that's also the other side of that equation is on the consumer side. You know, it's already kind of difficult, and there's a lot of, you know, gatekeeping and, you know, difficulty in sharing the knowledge of what wine is and what wine can be, and people are intimidated by it. And so by tearing that down a little bit too, I think will make it more likely for people to say, oh, let me try a Marquette, or let me try this field blend of hybrids that I've never heard of at a restaurant or off the store shelf, when they, you know, aren't as like, oh, I've heard of Pinot Noir, so let me buy that one. So I think we all in the industry have to work on that too, that making sure that things are open and accessible to everyone, and, you know, shut down the gatekeeping as much as we can, so that people aren't intimidated when they see something that they've never heard of before.
I think if someone's buying a bottle of Luca, do they really care what vine, you know?
Right. Yeah. And that was, we talk about that all the time. Like, you know, do we have to give all of our hybrid wines a fantasy name so that people don't really consider it? It's just like, it's Wild Ark Farm. It's got a cute name. We'll see what's in it when we read the back. But we call our Marquette because I love Marquette, and I think it makes a beautiful wine. And I want to kind of get those things out in the open a little bit more. So we'll go back and forth. We'll do a little bit of both, I think, for the near term. Cool. And we're also blending hybrids and vinifera in some wines too. So those we have to give a made up name to.
Well, but so my feeling on that, and you know, it evolves. But in 2017, when we brought Luca out, and it happened to be Dabonet grape, it was our favorite wine of that vintage. And so we named it after our daughter. But we were really afraid to work with it. I think we probably had bought the most Dabonet, right? That was like,
well, the grower had Dabonet, Chardonnay, and Cab Franc, and you know, we had to buy as much of all three as we could. And so we're like, okay, we'll see what it does. And then it was our second vintage ever. It ended up being our favorite wine from the vintage. So that was a turning point for us too. We learned, we were like, hybrids, who knows? I've had some good wines, some bad ones. I'm not excited about them. But after we made that wine, we're like, okay, yeah, this is fun.
Yeah. And then for me, how I explained it at a wine fair was that you don't have any preconceived notions, right? So it can taste like anything. And then, I don't know, I just felt almost better about that. Like,
yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's the same that we say about Piquette, is that if no one's had Piquette, you give them Piquette, they don't compare it to anything. So I've always kind of fought to avoid the comparison of a hybrid to whatever vinifera parentage it has, because Marquette has, you know, a little Pinot Noir in it. Dabonet is like Gewürztraminer. But no one is drinking a Chardonnay and trying to compare it to Gouais Blanc. So why do we have to do that for all of these hybrids? Because it's its own thing. It's its own grape. It now exists outside of its parentage. Let's just, you know, accept it and consume it for what it is.
Maybe some people know this, maybe others don't, but could I be accurate in saying that you're the first commercial release of Piquette in the US?
As far as we know, no one's corrected us or anyone else yet. But yeah, we in that same vintage, I believe the French producer, whose name I'm going to forget now, released a still version of it in 2017. And a little bit of that came over here. But yeah, we were the first commercial release in the US, as far as I know. And it's caught on like wildfire. For me, I know it's no longer, it's outgrown itself in that people use the Piquette hashtag on non-Piquette wines on the internet. It's just a thing now. It's like Petnat, Piquette, natural wine. It's all its own monster.
Well, I have to say that, you know, I think I didn't realize how conservative I was until I started expecting everyone to only call themselves Piquette if they made it the way you made it. And I was like, wait, I think I need to be a little more open-minded to this, because I've seen so many different expressions. You know, like we work with Andy from St. Reginald Parish, and he like references you even on his website, but you know, his is like carbonated. And it's like, it's all like everyone, I mean, I think what you've given people is this freedom to say, we don't need to only, I mean, most people, I think, especially when you start out, you have to make your credentials with like making serious wines, or I think a lot of people feel that pressure. And I think Piquette has really freed people up to say, like, I can be creative and inventive about working with the byproducts of my winemaking. And so in that way, I realize I should be more open-minded, because it's kind of cool to see that, at the end of the day, it is the economics of wine production, right? And whether you can be creative about it, like in the environmental world, it's about reuse, recycle. Is it what reuse, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle? And so in a way, it's the same thing. It's like anyone who can get more mileage out of the agricultural product, and they can help to offset costs so that we can make wines more affordable to people. I think, we just have to applaud that. But I do think that for me, your approach to it was really interesting, and maybe you could share with people, because I also have never heard it from you, but I've read a little bit about how you came across the term, and maybe it'd be nice for people to hear that story.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I had heard about it just in all of my reading and studies, and I was a wine nerd and consumer for 20 years before we started this venture, but had never considered making it until we have a friend who works at a wine shop up here in Kingston who is constantly reading these history books on wine and always just has a new crazy idea for you to try out. And he brought this book called The Red and the White, The History of Wine in 18th Century France and Italy by Leo Latourbe, I think it is. And there's just a paragraph, like 5 sentences about Piquette and how it was produced and how it was used and distributed. And he's like, yeah, you ever think of trying this? And we had already actually done the first part of the process, which is the second soak of the pomace, because we distilled some the first year. And so we said, all right, this year we'll just not distill it. We'll leave it in tanks and see what it does. And then, it became kind of an experiment in how do we make it taste good. So we had all these tanks of these still, 4 to whatever % wines. And we started bottling experimental bottles where we would hand dose the honey at like 5, 8, 10 grams per liter. We would add back 5, 10, 15, 20% of the wine. And then we kind of tested them after a month or two once they had carbonated and settled out, and decided on what worked best for us, which was about 12 grams per liter of tirage and about 15% of the wine added back, which brought it up to about 7% alcohol. And yeah, for us, that was just the first step in figuring it out. And we like to look at it like, the people who were drinking Piquette 200, 300 years ago were the same people who were forced to make do with scraps of animals and try to make, oxtail and beef heart and all of the awful taste good. And so the same things that they were doing, experimenting, long cooking, doing things to figure out what worked best, is probably what they were all doing with Piquette too. And although not a lot of that survives because there was no written history of what these individuals were doing, there are some interesting agricultural manuals from even 1700s in France that have a few recipes that we've been able to see since then. And so, yeah, we just figured it out that first year, and then just have refined the process since to get cleaner, more fruit forward, more interesting acid profiles in the wines, because you're dealing with a much higher pH once you've added the water back. There's a lot more lactic acid bacterial activity, because once you come above 3.5 pH, those lactobacillus, soinococcus, pediococcus strains are a lot more comfortable. So it's basically controlling oxygen contact at that higher pH, controlling temperature, and just kind of trying to keep things. It's more work to keep things clean, and we figured out ways with using sealed tanks to do that. But yeah, it's every year we kind of try a few things, see what makes it better, see what doesn't, and then just tweak the process as we go. It's also been harder to figure out how to scale, because when you're making 4 barrels versus 50 barrels, there's a lot more thought and work to be put into the Piquette side of things. So we're kind of trying to balance increased production with increased quality every season too.
Okay, I have a question now.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, so I have probably like a twofold question. So you were talking about the Luca and sort of working with, you know, these more rare hybrid grapes or grapes that people usually don't traditionally use. So I guess what is your approach to making wine with these hybrid grapes? Because I think, you know, with the Chardonnay or these other grapes, you're like, you can sort of pull from other winemakers and sort of twist from there. But using these hybrid grapes, what is your approach to making the wine? Like, oh, are we going to do a whole cluster this time, or we're going to do this or that? Secondly, I've heard a lot about your use of honey. Why the use of honey instead of organic cane sugar? And I sort of understand why, because of the way that you farm, well, the way that you encourage people to farm and the biodynamic aspects of that. But I want to understand, why do you prefer to use honey in your winemaking as well?
Sure. So first one, the hybrid grapes. It's twofold answer. Like with the Luca, the Dabonet, that was kind of one of the luckier breaks because we got it and we're like, all right, what should we do with this? It's aromatic. Let's see what it does with a little bit of skin contact. And that was 2017. That was the first year we worked with it. And like Crystal said, it ended up making our favorite wine that year. So we just kind of, we hit the nail on the head the first time around with that. When we started working with Marquette in 2018, we got 3 tons and we made 3 completely different vinifications. We did like slight skin contact rosé pet nat with it. We did a full carbonic maceration version of it with lesser élevage, and then we did a full whole cluster maceration of it with longer élevage in old oak barrels. And so that was just to see like, oh, what does it do? We haven't had much Marquette. Let's see how it responds from this site with these 3 treatments. And then since then, we've kind of, we've tweaked each of those until we decided which one we like the best. And now we landed on this year we do a 5-day semi-carbonic maceration of the Marquette, and then we foot tread it and do a whole cluster for 2 weeks after. And that for us is the best expression of that grape from that area. And that was, 3 vintages of experimentation to kind of land on that. So that's, the idea of, can hybrids represent terroir the same way that vinifera does? We think that they can, and we're just trying to figure out the best way to do that anytime we take on a new hybrid from a new vineyard. So yeah, we don't think of it any differently. We just it might be better to have less of a preconceived notion, because I worked with Gamay for the first time this year, and I'm like, well, if this isn't as good as Beaujolais, then I'm going to be bummed. With the Dabonet, it's like, well, if this is good, we're happy, regardless of what we compare it to. And then the second question, what was the second question? I got lost.
Second question was about the use of honey.
Honey, yes, right. Yeah, so that essentially, yeah, like you said, we, even organic cane sugar is still a refined product. It does not grow in our backyard. And the honey that we source right now, because we don't yet have our own apiary on site, is from 5 minutes down the road. And it's wildflower honey, so it's not bees that have been put at an agricultural site and are getting whatever single thing they have there. They're wild bees, wildflowers, all of the local flora. And so we consider that another kind of closer step to bring a little bit more of the local terroir into the wines. And, I used to homebrew beer 20 years ago in our Brooklyn apartment. And then I was looking into using honey, and everyone's like, oh, it's more expensive and you really don't get any additional flavor from it. So it's not so much that we're trying to add that flavor profile to the wine, although I do think you get a little bit more of a floral top note with honey than you would with refined sugar, especially at the 12 grams that we're using. But that's it. It's just basically it's local, it's a more sustainable product, and we don't have to bring it in from somewhere outside the neighborhood here.
Hi, Todd and Crystal.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for joining.
I have a comment and a question. I'm a ex-New Yorker myself, and back in the late 90s and the 2000s, Hudson Valley was only known for cheese, right? So it's really exciting what you're doing, and it's really inspirational, and really proud to be able to represent what you're doing here in Seattle on the West Coast. And I have a question. How did you come to choose, when you left your home in Brooklyn, Hudson Valley, as opposed to some of the other regions in New York, as opposed to the North Fork and the Finger Lakes? And what is your relationship with some of the winemakers in those regions?
It was more of at the time I had a job in the city, and I was commuting to the city for, 3 days a week. And so we were looking for something that would allow me to do that the plan was 5 years. I was going to have a job, and we were going to start this farm as a hobby farm to start and transition it into a full-time job. So that's why we kind of looked within commuting distance of the city. The North Fork would have been commutable a little bit longer, but also land costs out there and taxes are pretty prohibitive. Really, even in the Finger Lakes, if you're looking at vineyard sites that are close to the lakes, the land prices are significantly higher than just home sites. And here it's not like that at all, unless you're talking about an actual riverfront site where someone wants to put a McMansion. Land is cheap. It's $10,000 an acre regardless of where it is. So it was mostly that, like the proximity to the city, and then the idea, kind of, I guess the philosophy of it was, the Loire Valley has been supplying the cafes of Paris with, interesting natural glue wines for 100 years. Why isn't the closest wine growing region to New York City doing the same thing? At that point, no one up here had done any low intervention, low sulfur wines. And so we thought it's going to happen. It should happen.
You better not say that.
Why don't we try to be the first to do it and see how it works? So that was the other reason. And we grew up in central New York, so we're both New Yorkers. And then we'd been in the city for 18 years, so we're kind of splitting the difference right now between our childhood homes and where we spent most of our adult lives. So that also felt really comfortable. And relationships with other growers and makers, it's been great. Getting to know people, even thinking that we were kind of alone in what we were doing here, we found out that, well, actually that's not true, because Andrew at Eminence Road has been doing this for 20 years, but he's been sourcing all Finger Lakes fruit, but he's only about an hour from us to the north here. And he was an early mentor and helper, and we crushed our first vintage at his property. But then when we found, Zach at Lytton Buffel out in Western New York, he was, immediately like my go-to, because he had studied viticulture and had made conventional wine, is now making natural wine. So anytime I had a technical question, I could call him up and ask him. But everyone that we've met and that we've talked to has been super helpful and friendly and welcoming, regardless of what they thought of our idea of growing organically and vinifying low intervention wines, even if they think we're wild for trying it. But yeah, it's been really cool kind of seeing the development of that idea here across the state, and having it take hold a little bit more. And, Kim and Deborah from Bloomer Creek, again, they've been doing it for a long, long time, and they've been super supportive and helpful. And then, the younger folks who are just starting along with us, it's interesting to see more and more people try it. So that's why I'm trying to give the opportunity to more people to make wine up here, so I can show them that it's fun and it's feasible, and get more people. The more buyers we have for organic fruit, the easier it'll be to sell as a viable option too.
And then really winemaking wasn't a reality when we were moving. It was a dream. So we started looking at this area because we hiked the Appalachian Trail and we just wanted to be in nature. And then we just fell into our dreams coming true.
And then, yeah, my 5-year plan of keeping my job didn't work when they asked me after a couple of years to focus more on the winery. They thought I was losing my edge at the office. So that was kind of the kick in the pants that I needed to just make this a full-time thing and scale up a little bit more.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Can you speak a little bit to the, are you still growing all the sustainable foods like the tomatoes and herbs? And are you still making nocino? And are you thinking of making anything like vermouth or digestives?
Good question. We got our DSP license this year, so we actually can make and sell spirits on site here. We are making nocino again, but it's really the scale that we've been doing it at is pretty small. We'll make 40 to 60 bottles in a season. We will try to scale it up next year if we can figure out, getting some help from our farmhand on harvesting the walnuts for a couple weeks. We did a small run of Arak with some grape distillate that we distilled ourselves. That again is only about 40 bottles, but that was just something I've wanted to do forever. And so finally getting the opportunity to do it with wine that we made and distilled was awesome. And then, yeah, the grape distillate we also are using to put together some vermouth blends right now. Very experimental, 100 liters each just to see what works. And then hopefully, if it works, a lot of the stuff that we have planted in the food forest and the understory is specifically for spirits, for making vermouth and amaro. So we've got a lot of basically the northern equivalents of baking spices. We can't grow cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, allspice, any of that here. So we've got things like Carolina allspice, spice bush, northern bayberry. And so we're trying to figure out how we can use those things to make our northern version of vermouth and some amaro. So we're definitely working on it. We'll see how quickly we can scale it to be able to wholesale them.
Super.
And then the garden keeps us going all summer.
Yeah, we feed ourselves from the garden. Yeah. But yeah, I think we're looking at how we can expand our direct consumer sales on site here. And so I think, the long-term dream is to have something more akin to what Nate has at Hayu, where we can welcome people in here, we can feed them, we can give them food and drink from the property. But again, it's a lot of work, so we're slowly scaling up to it. He's got like a 10-year head start on us, so we'll just keep watching what he's doing.
Yeah, we'll be there in maybe 10 years.
Yeah.
Awesome.
We're out of space in the winery already, so the next step is, do we add on to that building, build another building, find something offsite? I'm not sure. We'll hopefully figure that out this year.
But you have a forklift now.
Yes. Oh, wow. Game changer. We rented one a couple seasons and then found out that we were paying twice as much a month to rent it as it would cost to buy a used one. So we have a full-time forklift here, which also, now that we're making more wine, makes it easier for us not to have to think. I used to, at bottling time, we would have to think about putting things high enough up when we were filling them that we could gravity feed our bottler. Now I can just lift them up with the forklift at bottling time. It's great because we don't use a pump.
Best investment ever.
It is amazing. I use it for stuff I didn't even think I would need it for.
Any more questions from anyone? Well, we don't want to take up too much of your time, and we're at the 1 hour mark, but I was wondering, would you maybe just, since your wine just arrived, like literally just arrived a couple days ago, and we're super excited about it because of the holidays. We haven't actually opened any samples because, the way our team has been working is the reason we started to do these Zoom calls is that we were trying to reduce our in-person contact, just to be a little bit more responsible in Washington. They decided to close down indoor dining again. And so we're kind of on a semi-lockdown. And so what we're going to do probably next week is open up samples of all the wines for our team to taste and, to taste with some buyers. But for the most part, because your production is still pretty small in relation to demand, a lot of your wines just get sold, pre-sold, or sold in advance of people getting a chance to try them. So we're excited for our team to be able to taste. We're committed. We're going to open everything and taste together. But if you could maybe just give us a brief, maybe talk us through what you sent us, if you don't mind, and just give us a brief kind of introduction to them. I think that would be a nice thing for us to have in mind when we taste next week.
Sure. Yeah. All right. So we'll start with the ciders. The Dabonet Greening Cider can. That was vinified the same way as the Northern Spy cider from the spring, which is just basically neutral oak for this one was 10 months because the Northern Spy came out a little earlier. And then Dabonet, like I mentioned, is it's a bittersweet apple, so it's got a little more tannin. And then bittersweet apples, for me, like the telltale note when there's bittersweet in a blend is it's got this kind of little butterscotchy thing on the nose. So for us, for a fall cider to be a little bit richer, a little more textured, and have a little bit of that butterscotch was the idea. That's why we let this one hang out in barrel for a little bit longer. And one of the 4 barrels was actually one of our chestnut barrels too. So that adds a little bit more spice without having the kind of vanilla baking spices of a new oak barrel. And so, yeah, it's not super luscious and rich. It's still a light acid-driven cider, but like I said, with a little bit more texture, a little bit of that butterscotch. It's really nice for fall, winter meals. And the High Falls Orchard cider is the culinary fruit cider. So those are some old varieties. So early McIntosh, Tiedeman's Red, Macoun, and Northern Spy, all from the same orchard in High Falls. Those we gave, I think, actually 48 hours again of maceration before we pressed them off. And those were an old French oak also for 10 months. That one has a little bit more of that kind of saline, but like I said, I don't like to say funk, but there's salinity and a little bit more of a, interesting non-fruit notes on the nose there. Savory, not necessarily salty, but yeah, savory focused. And that was a pretty small production too, but I think you got a few cases of that. The Piquette, this was the field blend Piquette, so that's the same as the Amarici field blend. Did you get both Piquettes, the Cab Franc also?
I think we only got the Cab Franc.
Only got the Cab Franc. Okay, right. Oh, right. The field blend was only 20 something cases this year. So the Cab Franc is, it's all, there was no Cab Franc anywhere from any of our growers in the Hudson Valley last year. So our Cab Franc we made from Finger Lakes fruit. That'll be coming out in the spring. But this is all Finger Lakes Cab Franc, traditional vinification. This one ended up pretty light because all of the fruit had a pretty extended maceration. So there's not a lot left to give as far as texture and flavor goes. So it's more on the cranberry light red side of things than the darker cherry fruit that you normally get from Cab Franc, but it still has a little bit of that green, which I like because of the extended skin contact with the water soak. Let's see. The Riesling, that's that Sawmill Creek fruit that you mentioned. Our idea going into this, since it's from a more conventional grower, was that we were going to make a conventional Riesling and just keep it sulfured and keep it super clean. But we decided to let it go through mallow and not sulfur it after the little bit at crush. And then we gave it a little bit at bottling, 10 parts per million. So it probably reads at unreadable or 5 or less right now. So there's barely any free sulfur in there, but it ended up being a really nice, really clean Riesling, but not super traditional Finger Lakes style. It's got a little bit more, again, savoriness and minerality to it. It went through some really weird phases after bottling. We were really nervous for like a couple of weeks, and then it settled out into this really beautiful, nice, almost crystalline Riesling. And Amarici Field Blend. It's our third vintage with that. That's the dozen different hybrids, red, white, and gris, all co-planted, co-harvested, co-fermented. This is the first year that we gave it a little bit of carbonic maceration, but we only did a few days. So it's not much different than the past vintages. And because it's been a year in tank, it really didn't stick around and give it too much, bubblegummy strawberry candy up front. But there's a little bit more fruit on the nose because of that. As these have aged, they've gotten a little bit more savory, and the oxidative qualities come out a little more quickly than I would like. So this was our idea, to try to give it a little bit more bright punch that hopefully, fades a little more gracefully with time. Because we do want to see what, even though it's a Rosato, we want to see what these do with 5 or 10 years in the bottle. Marquette, this is that whole cluster version of the Marquette. And when I mentioned we had been switching things around, so this was the second vintage where we did 2 vinifications, the carbonic and the whole cluster. One of these was in one of those chestnut barrels as well that had 1 use. That was just something we started last year because we had an extra chestnut barrel. We said, let's see what Marquette does in there. So it's bright fruit, again, if you want to talk about the parentage, Pinot Noir, it's bright red cherry fruit. And a little bit of spice from the chestnut barrel, but it's more kind of indiscernible green and woodsy spice as opposed to baking spices and vanilla. I really like that one this year. And then the Luca Skin Contact Traminette this year got a little volatile in the fermentation tank. We gave it 2 weeks on the skins this year. And then so we tried to keep it pretty reductive for the rest of the élevage. We put it in a larger puncheon and it tamed it somewhat. And now that it's been in bottle for a few months, it's taming further. But it is much more acid driven. It's much more, it gets you in your jowls when you drink it. Crystal, it might be too acidic for Crystal right now, but I bet in another month it's going to be exactly where it needs to be for her. But same aromatics, lychee, citrus peel, white flowers, just really nice, bright aromatics. Gewürz, similar. And then the Blackbird. Last year's Blackbird was Cayuga and Noire, so both hybrids, about 50-50. This year we didn't have access to that Cayuga, and we bought a lot of extra Riesling from the Finger Lakes. And our friend Zach, who I mentioned from Linton Buffel, he does these extended skin maceration whole cluster Rieslings that get like an almost red fruited Pinot nose on them. So my thought was, let's do whole cluster Noire and then let's do skin contact Riesling for 2 weeks on top of that to try to get some more aromatics from the Riesling skins that push that kind of red and white fruit character together. And it worked exactly as we wanted it to. It's like a little peppery from the Noire, but since it's only 30% instead of 50 this year, it's a little bit more subdued. So it's less. Last year's was like almost like a Pinot d'Anis. This year it's really more like a Pinot Noir with a little bit of a white pepper whiff on the nose. But yeah, this is one of my favorites this year. It really turned into this kind of tropical thing on the nose on top of the red fruits. So there's like a passion fruit thing from some tertiary fermentation output that I don't exactly understand, but we'll try to do it the same way next year and see if we can keep it going.
Yeah, super good chilled. You can just drink it. That's it.
Yeah, that's everything.
Well, thank you so much. Luke, do you have anything else to say before we wrap up?
One, Todd. No, I'm good. I think we really covered quite a bit of territory. At least my questions were answered. Thank you so much again. We're super happy to be representing you here.
Yeah, happy to have you representing us. Thanks.
I actually just pulled all the cans this morning, went out the door. So
awesome. Bigger can run this spring, so there'll be a lot more to go around, hopefully.
Yes, make more for sure.
It's nice for us because it means Todd drives the IBC totes somewhere else and they do the canning. So we're not bottling all of those. That's another benefit of canning.
Something that would normally take us 3 12-hour days to finish is done in 6 hours.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, we wish you happy Christmas and great holiday season.
Yeah, happy holidays to everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much again.
We're
Thank you.
available on Instagram or on our website if any other questions come up.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Ciao.